So it's my pleasure today to welcome here a great friend, but also a great intellectual, public intellectual in the United States. You have his CV, so I don't want to go back and steal from his time. But Mr. Herb London has been a great player in the, let's say, the market of ideas and the war of ideas over the past many years. One of his positions that has been very well noted by think tanks that you have been dealing with, both in Turkey or here, is that he has been the president of the Hudson Institute for many years. But his CV is very long, and you can already see that he has so many accomplishments. That's why you don't read those accomplishments, there are too many. But today he is here as the president of the London Institute out of New York, and I am one of the fellows on that center. And we do organize every probably month a meeting in Congress. It's a congressional briefing with many NGOs and foundations. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our great speaker today. He will be making his remarks for as long as needed. And he has been to Turkey. He's going to give us some of his experiences in Turkey, and then we'll open the floor for questions and answers. The whole program is going to be not beyond 4 o'clock, but we will divide it depending on what we feel. So, dear friend, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Dr. Faris, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It is a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you. It is a great pleasure to be with you. You are very fortunate students because I've learned a great deal from Dr. Faris, and I suspect you will be learning a great deal from Dr. Faris. He is truly one of the great intellectuals in this country, and so I'm very honored to be in this class. With War Clouds on the Horizon in 1937, George Orwell, who was one of the great figures in American and in European intellectual life, made the point that the first duty of responsible people is the restatement of the obvious. So much of what I'm going to say to you today is the obvious, things that you may very well be aware of, but hopefully we can go into some detail. The other point that I would make is a story that I very much like to tell, and perhaps I ought to mention it as an introduction. It is a story between a tiger and an ant. The ant is roaming the jungle, looking for food. He cannot find it. He runs into the tiger, and he says to the tiger, "I'm starving. Can you help me?" And the tiger says, "Of course. Whenever I'm hungry, I find an unwary antelope, I kill it, and I eat the meat around the carcass." The ant looks at him incredulously and says, "How can I possibly do that?" And the tiger says, "I gave you the idea, you take care of the details." Now that is very much one of the issues that we face in talking about foreign policy. There are people who have general ideas, but the devil is in the details. And so hopefully we can get into some of those details. But in describing the remarks that I would make today, I said that what we are seeing in the Middle East is a minuet called changing partners. The ideas of the past no longer prevail in the present. We are now living in a very different Middle East. And let me start with what is happening with the negotiations between the United States and Iran, what some have described as a rapprochement. The rapprochement has made many Sunni nations very uncomfortable. They believe that the imperial desire of the Persians in Iran is going to have some effect on the Egypts, the Turkeys, the Saudi Arabias of the region. And so you are now seeing a classic realignment. Saudi Arabia, which had been in the American camp, is now very uneasy about the role that the United States is playing. In addition, the Saudis have been supporting the rebels in Syria. When President Obama said that there is a red line, and if it is crossed by the Assad government, there will be action that is taken. Well, the red line turned out to be a line with no color. It was a dotted line, because of course it was crossed with poison gas. And the president reached for a lifeline, namely the role of the Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union, Russia. And Putin has bailed out the United States by saying, "We will help you in this matter by having the poison gas removed." The likely outcome, of course, is that Assad is ensconced, since Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Egypt have been supporting the rebels. They feel as though the President of the United States has betrayed them. So we are now seeing a very different kind of alignment in the Middle East, an alignment that has brought together what some might describe as strange bedfellows. It is interesting and quite unusual that Israel and Saudi Arabia would have common interests in this area. Not that they are necessarily in alignment on all issues. They'd see the world very differently in the Palestinian territory, but they both realize they have a common enemy, namely an Iran with nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapons are critical in understanding this calculus in the Middle East. Why? Because nuclear weapons are not only a military weapon. Nuclear weapons are also a political weapon. In any narrative that you describe about the Middle East, if you go to various stages of escalation, you reach a point where there's nuclear weapons and all other considerations stop. And so it's important to understand that the Iranians want nuclear weapons for a variety of reasons. And they already have them to some degree. 20% enrichment would allow them to probably build something on the order of 4 or 5 Hiroshima-like bombs tomorrow. The question, however, is what do they do with those bombs? The comments that have been made, which are somewhat extreme, that they would wipe Israel off the map in using those weapons, may be pure rhetoric. But in a theological state, one can't be entirely sure. After all, there's an imam that will return to earth during a great conflagration. And so notions of deterrence are very different when you have religious sentiment now playing a role in thinking through this political calculus. The role that the Iranians will play in the future is, of course, very much determined by the kind of understanding that is achieved with the United States. If, in fact, they freeze, the United States and Iran freeze the present allocation of enriched uranium, as I've indicated, there is the possibility that you can create nuclear weapons, but most significantly, there's also the possibility of weaponizing the existing missiles. One dimension of this so-called deal with the United States is that Parchin, the area in Iran where you have missiles, is not included in the discussion. The IAEA will not be evaluating what happens in Parchin. And this is the area where the missiles are located. So that becomes a critical feature of what happens in the understanding. It's also true that Iran is very much interested in creating what it calls the Shia Crescent. Several years ago, I met with the foreign minister of Iran here in Washington, D.C., and during the course of the conversation, I happened to use the expression, the Shia Crescent. He looked at me quizzically and he said, "Crescent? We want the full moon." So the aspirations of the Iranians are clear, and it is what has made the Sunni nations very uncomfortable. And this is not merely a conflict between Sunni and Shia, it is also a conflict between Persia and Arabs. And so that is, I think, part of the general format that I wanted to start with. Now, what is the role of the United States and how have things changed for the United States in the making of American foreign policy? President Obama has a view of foreign affairs different from any previous president. His view is one of transnationalism. His belief is that the United States as the hegemon in the world has caused more problems being the policeman of the globe than any of the solutions or equilibrium that we claim have occurred. And so his view is very different. Channel American foreign policy through the United Nations, through NATO, through multilateral organizations, with the belief that multilateral organizations will harness the excesses of the United States. It's one of the reasons why the president early on, during his first term, went to Normandy and actually apologized for the role that the United States played during World War II. Keep in mind that Europe would look very different if the United States did not play that role. But the president has his own view, And it's a view, as I've described it, of transnationalism, where the United States is one of many nations, not different, not superior, not more powerful, just different. When asked the question, is there something called American exceptionalism, the president responded by saying, I believe in British exceptionalism, I believe in Greek exceptionalism, I believe in American exceptionalism. In other words, there's nothing exceptional about our exceptionalism. And so when the President of the United States makes a claim of that kind, it is very obvious that the traditions that once prevailed among the presidents of the United States and in our foreign policy establishment are very different in this administration. So that, I think, will provide some background on, at least I hope provide some background on the President, on where he stands, and of course, what the correlation of forces as they are presently unfolding in the Middle East are. Now let me make one comment about Turkey, because Turkey becomes a key nation in thinking this entire analysis through. The president of your country, Erdogan, is a man who has a foot in two camps. One might be described as the moderate camp and the other the extreme camp. He is a member of NATO and at the same time has violated sanctions by selling gold to Iran. He has revealed the secrets of so many clandestine figures who have been operating in Iran in order to at least consolidate some influence with the imams in that country. On the other hand, he is also someone that President Obama relies on. If you ask the president, who is the one leader in the world on whom you most greatly rely, he would probably say Erdogan. Now, within Turkey, you have a very interesting situation because Turkey combines two continents, Europe and Asia. Turkey is a nation that bridges this extraordinary gap between these two continents in a variety of ways. One is through the possibility of gas lines. The other, of course, is that it is also strategically well located. It's not surprising that in this year the Chinese gave a gift to the Turkish government. It's the most advanced anti-missile system in the world. Why would the Chinese do that? They did it because they want to insinuate themselves into Turkey and play a role in the evolution of this country. Moreover, it also provides the Chinese with all of the software in NATO, since the largest army in NATO is Turkey's, and the second largest air force in NATO is Turkey. So it's a very dangerous game that's being played. The Turkish government, in addition, is a government that has prospered in large part because from 2002, when Erdogan was elected, to 2008, has been enormously prosperous. One of the fastest growing economies in the world, growing at roughly 9% a year. Now the government has failed because the economy has failed. The demonstrations on the streets clearly represent a resentment on the part of the people because of the tremendous debt overhang in Turkey. A debt so great that the banks can no longer lend beyond the 32% interest rate. My guess is that Erdogan is in a very difficult position politically, and I'm not sure that he can sustain himself, but that's nothing more than a guess. Most people in Turkey maintain a secular view of the world. It comes out of the Ataturk tradition. Mr. Erdogan has a somewhat different view. He believes that we should Islamicize the country. In rural areas, this is a popular view. In the Pew poll done very recently asking about religious attitudes in Turkey, most Turks, that is the majority, fairly large majority, consider themselves secular, do not consider themselves religious. Will this lead to problems in the future? Clearly, the nation that is paying the bills in Turkey, that at any point can turn off the spigot of capitalism, of capital, is Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis have a very different view, where the Wahhabist view of religion is very important. And they've attempted to influence the character of Turkey by changing this worldview. Now, will the Saudis be successful? Very hard to say, but they have tremendous leverage because they are paying the bills in Turkey today. So that, I hope, gives a little background on Turkey. on the United States and on the Middle East. Now your questions.
First of all, thank you so much for this very condensed, great overview of the Middle East, and I would like to thank you on behalf of the class.
Well, don't hesitate to ask questions. People are usually very shy and reluctant to do so. I love hearing from you. So if there's something that I've said that has offended you, please tell me. If there's something that you'd like to know more about, please tell me that as well.
Okay, class, so you could begin by asking a question or making a statement, or maybe an area that you need more information about. If I may, I could begin with one.
Good.
That is even more controversial in Turkey. Could you tell us more about the crisis between Israel and Turkey, especially since the incident a few years ago? Where is the state now? How does the Turks see it? How does the Israelis? Because you know both sides.
The Marmara incident had a very profound effect on Israel, in large part because for a considerable period, Israel and Turkey were close allies, very close allies. And even now, despite the fact that this incident had a very negative effect on Israel, there have been back-channel negotiations that have continued. There's still commerce between the two nations. In fact, very active commerce between the two nations. Israel has an advanced technological system. Turkey has been advancing very rapidly, as I indicated, in a 6-year period. And this year, Turkey will be producing more electricity than England. So you get an idea of the needs that exist in this country of more than 70 million people. So there is no question that on a commercial level, they maintain ties. Those ties are likely to increase, although there'll be a tension over them. The find of Leviathan, which is the largest natural gas exploration and find in the world, in the Mediterranean, will now involve Israel, Lebanon, Cyprus, and Turkey. How do you split those proceeds? The Turks are very much interested in this for an obvious reason. They do not want to rely on Russian natural gas. And if they build a natural gas line that goes through the northern part of their country, where you have a large Kurdish population, the Kurds aren't reliable because they could blow up that pipeline. You know that the Kurds aren't exactly predisposed to the Erdogan positions. In fact, what is very interesting is that in every school system in Turkey, one has to get up in the morning and say, I am a Turk. The Kurds won't do it. Very recently, in order to make an accommodation with the Kurdish population, the president has said, fine, you don't have to do so any longer. But it's a very problematic. It's difficult to know how things will evolve within the country. Outside the country, now you have this tremendous natural gas pool, and here you have countries competing for it. If you could build a pipeline going from Europe into Turkey through the Leviathan, and natural gas can be imported in that way, you no longer have to rely on Russian natural gas, which would be an enormous boon to the economy of Turkey and relieve some of the political pressure. So it is very interesting to see Turkey as a kind of midwife in the way in which things will unfold in this region. And as I indicated before, because it has a foot in 2 different continents, it is in a key geographic and strategic position. And that is one of the reasons why it represents the underbelly of NATO. The question, of course, in NATO today, is Turkey a reliable partner? And when they sold these, when they didn't buy the anti-missile system from the Chinese, it was given to them as a gift. Why? Because the Chinese want to have some understanding of all of the secrets in NATO, which they now possess. And by the way, that anti-missile system was probably stolen from Raytheon. I mean, that's mere speculation, but that's my guess. And so what you have is a very, very interesting and evolving situation with Turkey. If I had to guess, I would say Erdogan is not in a stable position. I don't know whether he will be defeated politically or there'll be a military coup. There have been a history, of course, of military coups in Turkey. The Turkish military has been purged by Erdogan, but still possible to have many opposed to him, in large part because there are demonstrations on the streets and because the economy is faltering. So there are a lot of interesting questions that arise over the next year or two. As I indicated, I think he's in a very unstable position, and if I had to engage in a wager, I would not wager that he will be the leader of the country 2 years from now.
That's a very provocative statement, challenging statement, especially for students who are coming from Turkey. So anybody has, yes sir,
I have questions.
can you state your name and then?
My name is Arhan. And my question is, why do countries like Saudi Arabia, Israel, and America oppose nuclear weapons, which Syria has? And why don't they take action when over 100,000 people are being killed in Syria?
Well, I mean, one of the problems that you have, and again, when you talk about the United States, you're talking about this administration. Why isn't the United States more active? There have been 100,000 people, as you quite rightly pointed out, who have been killed by Assad and his forces. The problem is that the United States never identified its interests and what it should do. Clearly, the president made statements 2 years ago when she said Assad has got to go. The problem, however, is that the forces that we would have to support are somewhat problematic. If you're talking about the rebels who are fighting against Assad, you now have Al-Qaeda playing a very significant role. 3 years ago, Al-Qaeda was not involved in the rebel forces. Now they play a very significant role in those rebel forces. This is the same group that was responsible for knocking down the World Trade Center and attacking the Pentagon and killing 3,000 people in the United States. So should we be providing weapons to support those people, even though they oppose Assad? That's one of the great problems. If this administration had taken a more active stance 3 years ago, when Al-Qaeda was not involved with the rebels, and had supported the Free Syrian Army, which we should have done in my judgment, then I think conditions would be very different today. But in fact, the president kicked the can down the road and did not take a stand until very recently. When he took a stand, making a rather impassioned statement about poison gas being absolutely unacceptable. We have international treaties against it, absolutely unacceptable. 100,000 people lost their lives. Something must be done. He knew that the Congress would not allow for anything to be done, so when the Russians handed him a lifeline, he held onto it and said, fine, we'll simply eliminate the poison gas in the country. But in fact, you now have Assad ensconced. So it is a very, very difficult and tricky situation for the United States. I think we've acted too late. I think the president really wasn't sure. I don't think he defined American interest early on. So I think there are a lot of problems associated with this matter today. And I don't know how it's going to unfold, but I can assure you this administration has made it clear that we are going to do nothing in effect to eliminate Assad from his position of authority.
Yep, please go ahead.
And you said they are the poison weapon, but also the United Nations said something, published something, which is the plane which is without man, which is the America has.
Drones, you mean?
Yeah, they also use it, and they don't recognize the people who in the land, and they attack them. The civil people also become killed.
Well, first of all, there are no American drones that are being employed in Syria. But there are drones all over the Middle East that are employed, and there are drones that were used in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and clearly in other places, Yemen, Oman, where there have been radical elements, and the United States feels they threaten American interests and threaten the stability of those governments. When you talk about drones, one of the problems that I have is, suppose I told you I have an F-16 that is flying in the air, it's 300 miles from a site, but it has a computer-driven bomb on it. I fire that weapon from 300 miles away, and it kills the enemy, and might have collateral damage as well. In the case of a drone, the drone is flying at 4 miles in the air. Again, it has a target on the ground. It has a target that it wants to achieve. It hits that target, and there may be collateral damage as well. What is the difference between the F-16 as a platform and the drone as a platform? I don't see it. I just don't understand it. Both of them, except one is manned by a person, and one is manned by a robot or remotely. But in effect, they're both platforms. They both have the capability of causing a lot of damage. And the goal here is, of course, to eliminate in the most rigorous, but at the same time, the most careful manner, the way in which drones are used. It's not as if drones are simply in the air every day, firing capriciously. They are firing at specific targets of known terrorists. Will there be collateral damage? Of course. You're in war. If you're in war, there's always collateral damage, unfortunately. I mean, I don't want to see anyone killed. I'm basically a peaceful man. But at the same time, I recognize the fact that if you're fighting against enemies, there are times when you don't only take out the enemy.
Thank you.
Next, Dila.
Okay. What can you tell us more about the new alliances after the US-Iran deal, considering the Gulf states?
Well, there are several things that I think I should have mentioned before, but Dila, thank you very much for asking the question. One thing that is very likely to occur is that Saudi Arabia will buy nuclear weapons from Pakistan. That deal has probably been consummated already, which means that you will start to see proliferation of nuclear weapons in the Middle East, a very dangerous situation in my judgment. Not only will you have the nuclear weapons in the hands of Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia will probably work out some sort of deal with Turkey as well, where nuclear weapons will exist in Turkey. As I indicated before, the Turks and the Saudis are very close, in part because the Saudis have tremendous influence and leverage over the Turkish government and the Turkish economy. That also means that Egypt might be in the mix as well. Now, if you start to see several nations with nuclear weapons, the great danger, of course, is how do you control that? No one wants to see nuclear war, and this is a horror that the human imagination cannot possibly cope with. But at the same time, it becomes very realistic when you have several nations possessing nuclear weapons, and you also have deep-seated hostility that exists among those nations. So it's hard to know how it will play out, but the frightening part about all of this is that an Iran with nuclear weapons clearly puts other nations at risk, and those nations will try to deter Iran. And the way to deter them is to have nuclear weapons of their own. Deterrence is an interesting idea when there's credibility associated with it. During the Cold War, the United States and Russia were engaged in something called mutually assured destruction. The acronym was MAD. We would hold the Russian population hostage, and they held the American population hostage. We didn't want to die, they didn't want to die. And so that's what deterrence is all about. If, however, you have a person who says, as Ahmadinejad, the former leader of Iran once did, so we lose 20 million people. So we lose 20 million people. What difference does it make? After all, when this great conflagration occurs, the 25th imam will return to earth, and what we will have is a period of peace and prosperity thereafter. Now, if you believe that, I don't know whether he really believes it. I don't know whether it's just empty rhetoric. But if that is one of the considerations, then the notion of deterrence as we understand it traditionally, as the credible exchange of opinion and the fear that one side doesn't want to die and the other side doesn't want to die, that is all very different. You can't deter under those circumstances. Can you contain? Again, how do you contain? It has to be the belief that sufficient power exists on the other side so that you do not want to engage in any offensive action. And that, again, becomes one of the great issues in the Middle East. How do you develop the forces necessary to prevent another nation from attacking? One of the reasons why Turkey becomes extremely important in this calculus is that, as I indicated before, it has more airplanes, more tanks, it has more military equipment, and has the second largest air force in NATO. And so when you talk about a military power in the Middle East, Turkey has it in conventional terms. In conventional terms, Turkey has it. So it becomes extremely important for Saudi Arabia to use Turkey as a surrogate in all of its conflicts. And that is now happening with the Saudis and the Turks engaged in continual conversations about the maintenance of peace in the Middle East.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you for that question, by the way. I should have made mention of the proliferation issue before.
Any other questions, statements? Yes, sir.
My name is Furkan Emisar. What can you tell us more about Al-Qaeda in Syria? Is it part of the Al-Qaeda International? Are there other opposition groups that are moderates?
There are, within the rebel forces, you have a variety of elements. One of them is an Al-Qaeda Force al-Nur, which is nothing more but an extension of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has branches all over the globe, including South America. So this is merely one branch. all of the rebel forces are not composed of Al-Qaeda. There are warlords, there are individuals who are trying very hard to maintain or grab a portion of power in an area where everything is in play. And one doesn't know how the political situation will unfold even if Assad is removed. So let's say he's displaced tomorrow. You'll have an Alawite faction, you'll have a Sunni faction, and you'll have a Kurdish faction. One of the sensible things to consider is not a Syria that is coherent, but a Syria composed of 3 states. But again, things have to settle down, the dust has to clear before any consideration can be given of 3 separate states within Syria. But the point about the rebel forces is that within the rebel forces it's chaotic. It's not at all clear who runs the rebel forces. Can they even operate together? It's not as if this is a coherent fighting force. There are many elements in it. But what Al-Qaeda has done, Al-Qaeda has entered the rebel forces fairly recently, only within a year or so. And within that year, they've also created a political arm. Why the political arm? Because they realize that if they have a political arm, once the dust settles, once some conference takes place where political considerations come into effect, they want to be able to say, we're not merely a military force, we're a political force as well. So they've organized a political arm within the rebel territories. Again, how things will shake out, there's a democratic element there too. But are they in a position where they can exercise sufficient authority to take over when Assad leaves? That's very doubtful. And as I indicated to you before, the Kurdish population in Syria is very large. It represents about 20% of the total population, and also in areas that are fairly rich in oil, just like Iraq, where you have a very large Kurdish population, and most of the oil fields are in Kurdish territory. So this also becomes a factor. And they are not great fans of Alawites or the Sunnis. So that becomes a very interesting dynamic. And as I said, no one at this moment knows how it's all going to shake out, except that if you look at the rebel forces, the one thing that you can say, there is nothing coherent about them. It is chaotic. And there are many different factions within the so-called rebels. It's nice to use one word like rebels, but it conveys the wrong impression. It is not as if it's one fighting force.
Thank you. I would like to ask a question. We're going to tape it also. President Obama and his team opened up to the idea that the current Iranian regime under Mr. Rouhani is the one that can make things happen in terms of negotiations on the Iranian nuclear project. Question number 1, why do you think the Obama administration thinks that Rouhani really can make that deal? And number 2, what are the actual real expectations of the Obama administration for the next 6 months, 2014, and maybe beyond? Do they really believe that we're seeing a sort of a Gorbachev in Iran or not?
I think it would be, let me answer the first question first, of course. Rouhani was the negotiator on nuclear weapons for the last 10 years. So, I mean, he's been at the negotiating table. We know him. He is more moderate in appearance. He has a more pleasant smile. But he represents the same imams and Khatami just as he did 10 years ago. So it's rather foolish to assume that there's a different organizational force within Iran at the moment. Same people. What does Obama want? And what is Obama expecting? And how would things unfold a year from now or in the future? I will give you my guess because I think I have a pretty good idea of what will happen. Obama is a president who is continually campaigning. He doesn't know how to govern, in my judgment, but he is a very, very effective campaigner. He will bring a piece of paper home at some point when they go to phase 2, phase 3 of these negotiations and say, Neville Chamberlain-like, I brought about peace in our time. People say to me that diplomacy doesn't work. I'll show you that diplomacy does work, and that we have reached some understanding with the Iranians, and rather than go to war or use the military option, we don't have to do that. We've arrived at the understanding. What is that understanding? The understanding, in my judgment, will be the following. Enrich uranium even up to 80%, which will allow you to build some very advanced nuclear weapons. Just don't weaponize them. That is, don't attach them to missiles. And so we can say, they have no capability of attacking us, or for that matter, any of their neighbors. The weapons are not, the missiles, bombs rather, are not weaponized, so there's nothing to worry about. Now, this is the Japanese solution. In Article 9 in the Japanese Constitution, they are prohibited from having nuclear weapons. The Japanese realize they also live in a very dangerous area of the world. You have Chinese with nuclear weapons, and so they want to be in a position where they can have nuclear weapons. So they have enriched uranium, so they have enough fissile material to build something on the order of 300 to 400 atom bombs or plutonium bombs very quickly. It would take about 2 months to weaponize them. They have the missiles that have a range of anywhere from 3,000 to 4,000 kilometers, so they could reach every major city in China if they had to. They realize that North Korea has nuclear weapons, and within roughly 10 minutes, you can fire a missile from Pyongyang to Fukuoka and take out Fukuoka. So they've got to do something to deter the North Koreans. What can they say? You know what? You want to play this game, chicken. We have nuclear weapons of our own. So we haven't weaponized our missiles. Now this notion, this model, will be the model that will apply to Iran. And we'll say, you see, they are no longer a threat. Will this satisfy Israel? I don't think so. Will it satisfy Saudi Arabia? I don't think so. But it will satisfy the American public. So with great fanfare, Obama will get on TV and he will say, I have done something that my predecessors could not do. I brought the Iranians to the negotiating table. We have an understanding. We no longer have to worry about missiles being used in that part of the world. And for a time, I think this will hold. But recognizing the fact that they can weaponize at any point, it would probably take 3 weeks to weaponize a missile, but they could do it. And that is why Israel and Saudi Arabia will still have to give some consideration to the military option. But that's speculation, so please understand that I regard that as nothing more than speculation. I'm not at the negotiating table, but there's a part of me that understands what has happened in the past and what I think is likely to happen now. The president will use this for very important campaign purposes. Keep in mind that he has had political setbacks with the NSA, with the IRS, with Obamacare. There's been one political setback after another. Think of this as being an enormous political victory, with the president appearing on primetime TV saying we have brought about a peaceful condition in the Middle East that was not possible in the recent past.
Now, a follow-up question, if I may. If the president is going to be using this in a political campaign, the only one that he has that is important for him is the midterm elections very soon. Now, that brings about the issue of Congress. Congress has a different landscape, a different political landscape. Most Republicans and a significant number of Democrats do not trust the Iranian regime, and we know that they're preparing many legislation. So what engineering is going to bring President Obama to help his allies in Congress to be elected or re-elected, while they know that their districts, and I'm going a little bit into American politics here, may be very nervous about, where would he use this "I brought you a piece of old times" in a campaign that may hurt or not hurt his allies?
I will use one political figure as a model for how this thing will unfold, and that's Senator Schumer of New York.
Yeah.
Schumer has been one of the advocates of a pro-Israeli position, adamant about it. He had his real test when Senator Hagel was going through the confirmation process, and he caved on that one. Many Jewish organizations did not want him to support Hagel. In the end, he did support Hagel at the behest of the president. Now he's going to be facing a similar test, because you can imagine that most of the pro-Israeli groups in the United States are very much concerned about this deal with Iran. And Schumer is right in the center of this. He's pro-Israel, he's pro-Obama. How does he choose? The answer to that is, I think, a statement that will be made by Obama. It will be a concession that he will ask for at the negotiating table with Iran. He will say to the Iranian leaders at this negotiating table, since I've got an internal political problem that I must address with members of my own party, the Democratic Party in the Congress, I would like you to make a statement saying, Iran, whether it has the capability of creating nuclear weapons or not, will not use them to attack Israel. It's a statement. It's not a pledge, it's a statement. That statement will go very far towards satisfying Schumer so he can use it in his campaign. But not just Schumer, I'm only using him as an example. But where other Democrats can say, you see, we got this concession from the Iranians. And it will be worded in a manner that will provide some level of acceptance, but not necessarily reassurance. So they're not going to say, under no circumstances will we ever consider. That is not in the cards. But it will be a statement that will have some political effect. And it's a very interesting question, because I keep thinking, what is going to happen in the Congress? There are people who are running in 2014, as you've noted. It's a key year. If the Republicans gain control of the Senate, this becomes an administration that's paralyzed. Well, not paralyzed, because Obama tends to ignore the laws that are passed by the Congress anyway. But it becomes a very, very interesting moment in the political in the political judgments that surround the off-year election.
Wonderful. So does it open the appetite for more? Yes, sir.
I have a question.
Please.
2 years ago, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Prime Minister of Turkey, wanted to attack Assad because of his murders. But United States didn't listen to Erdogan very much and left him alone in this issue. And Erdogan could see the future, what will Assad do to Syrian people, for example, chemical weapons. After only chemical weapons, United States wanted to attack Assad. So my question is that Turkey was the best partner for the United States in the Middle East. And what changed that the United States left Turkey alone before chemical weapons? And I think that the relationship between Turkey and the United States injured because of this reason. And how do you see the relationship between Erdogan and the United States at the moment?
Well, Aragon has said when the United States made the point, when I should say the Obama administration made the point, that we are not going to attack Syria. We are simply going to rely on the Russians to have them give up their poison weapons, their gases that could destroy a lot of people. When that happened, Aragon said, I feel a sense of betrayal. He was in Washington the following week after that, after the expression of that sentiment. And he brought with him the leading spy master in Turkey, who has also worked very closely with the Iranians. And the reason for that is he was saying to Obama, look, you said that Assad has got to go. You have also said that you regard Turkey as a key ally in this area, and now you betrayed us. And the Saudis have exactly the same sentiment. That's why I'm saying, and said right at the beginning of this presentation, that where you have a changing partners. Turkey was regarded by the United States or by the Obama administration as his closest ally. His words, not mine. Aragon was his closest friend on the world stage. And Saudi Arabia, of course, has had close ties to the United States, where we've not only sold advanced weapons like the F-16s to Saudi Arabia, but we have been involved in developing their anti-missile system. So you're seeing a Saudi Arabia and a Turkey that is now saying, can't trust the United States. And as I said, Erdogan is very sly. He is something of a, excuse the expression, schizophrenic. On the one hand, as I said, he will join the evil forces or the most extreme forces in the Middle East, and on the other hand, he will join the moderate forces when that's necessary. At the moment, he is tied into Saudi Arabia, has to be, because of the economic leverage that the Saudis have. I'm now repeating myself. But the economic leverage that the Saudis have give him great comfort. Not only great comfort, they will bail him out whenever there's difficulty. At some point, the Saudis will say enough is enough. We bailed you out long enough. And he will fail. And that's why I indicated before I think Aragon is gone. But to come back to the alliances, the United States is no longer trusted by people who once trusted us. Netanyahu in Israel has already made the statement that this rapprochement with Iran is a historic mistake. Those were Netanyahu's words, not my words. Historic mistake. That means there's no rectifying this. This is an error. And so Israel, which has been closely tied to the United States, no longer believes it would get America's approval if in fact it decided to engage in a unilateral attack against Iran. In the past, Israeli governments felt we could count on the United States, even in difficult circumstances. When Israel attacked the Osirak nuclear facility in Iraq, going back to the 1970s, the mid-1980s, Ronald Reagan condemned Israel. Afterwards, he said Israel made the right decision. But that was months later. Initially, he attacked attacked Israel, or verbally attacked Israel. We would find ourselves in a situation like that today, where if Israel were to engage in this kind of attack, I don't think that the forces in Washington would be at all pleased. In fact, they're far more concerned about an Israel that would attack Iran than an Iran with nuclear weapons. That is the prevailing sentiment. And it's a dangerous one in my judgment. But thank you for the question.
I'll try another question and we'll see if our seminar has more. There's one big player which is making inroads, that's Russia. What's your take on Russia after President Obama withdrawal from confronting Assad and after Obama's deal with the Iranians, knowing that both Assad and the Iranians are allies to Mr. Putin? So how can you see that equation?
In the 1970s, when Syria was defeated in battle by Israel, and Syria at that point was a surrogate of the Soviet Union, Russians were forced out of the Middle East. It was the United States influence that forced Russia out of the Middle East. Now we not only have Russia back into the Middle East, but they're invited by the United States. There's real irony in this matter. What is the Putin game? The Putin game is very clear. One, it's natural resources. He would like to get his hands on that natural gas in the Mediterranean, and if he cannot, he would like to prevent that natural gas from reaching the hands of the Middle East, because he wants them to rely on Russian natural gas, which is the only hard currency that the Russians are able to obtain. The second part of this is that if you look at Russia today, they are a powerhouse in this area. You have more Russian vessels in the Mediterranean, in Tartuffe, the port in Syria, than you do American vessels in the Mediterranean. So the Russians are already displaying their muscle in that part of the world. So where does Netanyahu go 2 weeks ago? He goes to Moscow to sit down with Putin. Why? Why would he go to Putin? Because he no longer believes that the United States is the key player, and maybe Russia that's the key player. And the Saudis are doing the same. There have been diplomatic overtures to Russia, in large part because they recognize the influence that Putin has. So Putin, who may be the richest man in the world, in part because he owns a significant portion of Gazprom, personally, he may be the richest man in the world, and he would like to see not only Russian control over natural gas in that part of the world, but also to reclaim the near abroad, the portion of the Soviet Union that was lost after, of course, the great détente with the period of 1979, when we saw the fall of the wall and the breakup of the Soviet Union. The situation that we see in the Ukraine today is a perfect illustration of this, where you have Putin playing hardball with Yanukevych, the present president of Ukraine, and the people are out in the streets demonstrating because they want to be associated with the West. They want to be associated with the EU. And what is Putin saying? Don't you dare do that. So it is interesting that the Russians now feel they can reclaim a portion of the territory they lost and regain that kind of empire-like status, in part because of the weakness of the United States. It's fascinating to me that you have not heard one formal comment from the State Department about what's happening in the Ukraine today. There are demonstrations on the street, strong-arm tactics by the president, and yet not a word from this administration, because they have pretty much made a deal with the Russians. We're going to allow you to play a central role in the Middle East, and we will allow you to reclaim some of the territory in what was sometimes described as the near abroad, those portions of the full Soviet Union, portions that were in the orbit of the Soviet Union in the past. It's a very ironic moment in world history. When asked to describe this in the past, I was on a TV program where I was talking about this matter. I said, here's a combination of 1848, 1917, 1941, and 2001, all combined. All of these critical moments in history, all combined in one moment. We are living through that moment where we're seeing the changing of forces all through the Middle East, all through Europe, and to some degree, even in Asia. And the weakness of the United States, there's no such thing as a vacuum in international affairs. There's probably not a vacuum in natural affairs, but certainly not in international affairs, as you better than almost anyone knows. And when you have a United States that appears weak, we're still the strongest country in the world, but we appear weak and unwilling to exercise whatever strength the United States has, you have the China creating an air defense zone in the East China Sea, doing so unilaterally, and saying, we're going to protect this area, it's ours. And what is within that area? The Senkaku Islands, which of course have been disputed with Japan. So even though the Japanese have been given the right to those islands in 1972, they are now disputed by the Chinese. Why? Because there's no United States there. Every year, excuse me for the venting, but every year I'm invited to Japan to give a lecture, a kind of tour de raison on world affairs. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was the attitude of the Shinzo Abe regime, administration in Japan, because he has eased the currency. He's been printing a lot of yen to deal with the deflationary status in Japan. And there were two members of the Bank of Japan who were present at the lecture. And they interrupted right in the middle and they said, we don't want to discuss that. We want to know, where is the United States? Where is the United States? What an odd question. I said, what do you mean? They said, well, we are now fearing an active blue water Chinese Navy operating not only in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, but also operating in the Sea of Japan. It is making us very nervous. We have doubled our defense budget in 1 year. We are very much concerned about the role that China is playing, but we have a mutual defense pact with the United States. Where is the United States? Why aren't they standing up to China? We're not asking them to go to war, but when there was saber rattling in the 1990s, Bill Clinton sent the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait, just a show of force, nothing more. Where is the United States today? The answer is we have 280 naval vessels in our Navy today. It is the smallest Navy in American history, smaller than the Navy before World War I. Of the 280 vessels that we have, only a third are active at any given moment, because you have 1/3 out for repairs, 1/3 that are in a form of rest and relaxation, and 1/3 that are active. That means we have 90 vessels to cover the globe. Can't be done. So even though we still have the world's largest Navy, even though we are the most powerful nation in the world, we are acting as if we are weak and ineffectual. And other nations recognize that.
One more chance. Anybody? I'd like to, my own finding after your great report is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there has been a paradigm shift in our foreign policy, in this foreign policy that you have described so well under this administration, both affecting the military, the deployment, but also perception from the region, that there has been a paradigm shift in Russia. So we are in decline, in perceived decline, whereby Mr. Putin regime or government is perceived as getting stronger. After Syria and the engagement with Iran, the direction of U.S. policy in the region has changed dramatically. Expectations are not so clear in terms of the outcome with Iran, but clear with regard how to use that outcome in our domestic politics. There is a question about what will happen if Iran actually will reach the point of ready to be nuclear without being nuclear. Will that trigger a race with the Saudis and of course the Turks and others? The Israeli-Turkish crisis is true, but there's still economic ties between both, and other very important questions. So I would think these are the major findings that the seminar will be discussing, and if you have any general thoughts, I'll be very happy that
Well,
you
I
give
like
us your
to-
guidance.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, Dr. Ferris, and as I indicated right at the outset, students in this class may not realize it, but they're very fortunate to have you as an instructor. But you raise, I think, a critical issue. The paradigms as we've known them in foreign policy are shifting. It is, from the standpoint of the analytical structure of foreign policy generally, a fascinating moment in our history, but at the same time, a very dangerous moment. I find myself in the position where there's an awful lot of material to write about and to think about, but at the same time, I also recognize it as very dangerous. My children, I have children who obviously are going to be succeeding me in positions of influence, I hope. One of them, I suspect every woman in this room knows. You ever see a TV program called What Not to Wear? No.
They will.
We only watch news.
It's the most popular cable program in the United States. My daughter is the host of the program.
Oh.
If you've watched TV in the United States at all, you have seen her because she does the Pantene ads. So she kind of sweeps her hair back. She's a very attractive young lady. In any case, that's neither here nor there. But I am concerned about the kind of world that my children will live in. And I don't have grandchildren yet, but I hope I will. And I would like to see them in a world where there was far more stability. I think peace is a much overused word, so I never use it. But a stable world, I think, is critical. And we have lived with we do not understand the extent to which we've lived in relative stability since the end of World War II. And I was engaged in a debate with a fellow who said that has been brought about because of the creation of the United Nations immediately after World War II. And I said, the United Nations is responsible for stability in the world? Nonsense. It's something called the United States Navy. Our military forces were able to provide freedom of the seas. And that is what has accounted in large part for the relative stability that we've enjoyed. I don't know if that can continue into the future. And I worry about a world where you have chaos that has to be managed, where you have an administration that's not capable of doing it, where you have American people who are suffering from war fatigue. They're not interested in foreign policy issues. And so it becomes a very, very dangerous world in which to make any judgments about the future.
We do have a question which is not political, with the last question about what would be your advice to young Turkish students who are now in Washington, United States. This generation and other generation, how do they go about understanding U.S. foreign policy? Where to look?
I would say, when people always ask me the questions, how do you understand what's happening? I would read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, two very different editorial positions. I would read the National Review, the National Interest. I would read from both the left and the right. It's the only way to really get some understanding of how things are unfolding in the United States from different opinion leaders on both the left and the right. And it's important to get both perspectives. I would also argue that we now live in a world where the internet provides information on the most instant basis. Anything you want to find out, you can find out instantly on the internet. And so the world is at your disposal, it's at your fingertips. So anything you want to learn, you can learn. Within your own country, there is likely to be great convulsion. I'm absolutely persuaded, because as I indicated before, the economy is so fragile. But we'll see. But if you want to understand the world that you're living in at the moment, it's important to try and read as many different sources as you can, and to recognize the fact that Americans do not generally, the average person, does not take American foreign policy seriously. So you have to search, but it's not too hard to find the material that's necessary to develop your own opinions.
I would like, on behalf of the class, the students, the faculty, and VEU out of Istanbul, to thank you for being with us today. And we have a usual gesture on behalf of the classroom. The student will offer you, we're going to have a photo plate, a book on the history of the Ottomans.
Oh, well, thank you, thank you. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. I have been, as I indicated before, I have been to Istanbul. It's one of my favorite cities, so I thank you very much indeed for this gift.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's a great
Thank you so much for being
Pleasure
here.
to be with you.
And a big applause